What Ray neglected to mention is that in this project team, I am the one sociopath. So I'll dispense with the pleasantries, except to say that I love coming to Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh is one city where every time I come here, I imagine myself living here. And that doesn't always happen, but it's the kind of city that gives you that feeling. Yes, clap, clap. But it is that kind of city, and it's just wonderful how the people who live here understand that and are working to make it so much better. So I'm here to talk about the walkable city. I give talks about why we need it, and I like to give talks about how to do it. I'm not going to give you the talk about why we need it, because you already get it here. You understand that. You've been hearing from a lot of other speakers who explain why your city needs to be so walkable. And also, it's a TED Talk. So if you want to see it, go to TED, look me up, and you can see that talk, which is not what you're getting today. What you're getting today is how to do it. And we begin with this premise, that walkable places are thriving places. We used to have to argue to convince people of this. We don't have to anymore. That premise leads to this question: if walkable places are thriving places, how do you get people to walk? Which leads to what we call our general theory of walkability. The general theory of walkability is the backbone of my book, Get a Good Look. I hope you read it, Walkable City. And this is such a short version of what I've been able to lay out at length in the book. So if you want to learn more, there it is. But the question is, if the question is how do you get people to walk in America, where driving is so easy and so cheap, and the car is there in the driveway between you and everything, then the answer is the walk has to be as good as the drive. And to accomplish that, it has to do 4 things simultaneously. It has to be useful, it has to be safe, it has to be comfortable, and it has to be interesting. And if you don't do all 4 of those things, you will not create walkers by choice. And if we don't create walkers by choice, we don't develop our city around walking, and therefore those who don't have a choice but to walk have a city that does not serve them well. So this has to be our collective goal. So the first category, and those 4 mandates are the structure of my talk today. The first category, the reason to walk, is what we call, my mentors taught me, Andre Stwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, we call the story of planning, and the story of the planning profession. And what that was, of course, was that people were choking on the soot from your dark satanic mills, right? And the planners came along and said, hey, what if we move the people away from the factories and put the housing somewhere else than from the factories? And of course, when that happened, the planners were hailed as heroes, because lifespans increased immediately and dramatically, and essentially we've been trying to repeat that victory, great victory, ever since, with the onset of Euclidean zoning and the separation of the landscape into large areas of single use. And I was an art history major, and they say that's not so valuable, but I can say, you don't want a Rothko, you want a Syrah. Syrah was the pointillist, right, and the finest grain of use. And now, of course, we're not zoning by use at all anymore. We're zoning by form, by building type. But if you must zone by use, for example, to keep that liquor store away from the high school, then you just do it at the smallest possible grain, the confetti scale of zoning. And our most walkable places then have the tightest zoning of uses. And this then kicks into the new urbanism was mentioned earlier. I try to not leave a place without very quickly telling the fundamental story of new urbanism, which is to understand that there are only 2 tested ways to make community throughout history and across cultures. One is the traditional neighborhood, defined as being compact, as being walkable, as being diverse, places to live, work, shop, recreate, all close by. The other, of course, is suburban sprawl. The name tells you it's not compact. Whole square miles hold just one thing, or often just one house, repeated over and over again. And then because so few of the streets actually connect anywhere, those few that do become what we call traffic sewers. They move as many vehicles as possible. They're noxious. The houses turn their backs to them. You see that? And so you have maybe a walkable cul-de-sac within a completely unwalkable system. So sprawl is fun to break down into its constituent parts: the places where you only live, the places where you only work, the places where you only shop. Our civic institutions get bigger and bigger and bigger, separated from each other then by further and further distances, and the ratio of the parking lot to the school tells you all you need to know about this typical South Florida high school, which is, no child has ever walked to it, no child will ever walk to it, and the seniors and the juniors are driving the sophomores and the freshmen with the death rates to back it up. And then even athletic facilities, so that it's great, that Weston in Florida has 8 soccer fields and 8 baseball diamonds, but, that kid needs his mom to drive him a mile to get to that facility. Of course, when we were young, there were no soccer moms because we all had 1 or 2 facilities in close proximity. So supersizing, separating, and if you separate everything from everything else and you reconnect it only with automotive infrastructure, then of course your highway system, which was created for commerce and created for holiday travel, becomes a commuting way. And we invest more and more in our roadways. So I always tell people, this for many is the American dream. Not for that many anymore. It's probably about only 10% that want a house that is isolated from every other use. But if this is your dream, then this is the other half of your dream, because the two come together, and they're part of the same system, which is the other system. Often to absurd extremes, the investment that we make in our horizontal infrastructure, right, robbing our churches and robbing our post offices and our city halls of great architecture so that we can have a gold-plated ground plane. Because God help you in this environment, if you're stuck for 2 cycles at a signal, you want to shoot yourself, right? So it has to not allow that to happen. So the experience of being a driver can be extraordinarily frustrating. This is not Photoshop. This is a real intersection. It's no fun being a driver, and being a pedestrian can be even worse. So this is a slide that the doctors have been showing for 15 years now. I got this from an epidemiologist who's one of many people who say, the reason why we have the first generation of Americans who are expected to live shorter lives than their children than their parents, and that fully 1/3 of all children born after the year 2000 are expected by the CDC to become diabetic, is because we've engineered out of our lives the useful walk. And the idea that you would not consider it absurd to drive to park in the parking lot, to take the escalator to the gym, to get on the treadmill, to walk, is at the fundamental root of so many problems in our society. So these are the 2 forms of development. And now I'm ending the part of the talk where I talk about new growth, because this has been all about, how do we make new places? You either make sprawl or you make neighborhoods. It's the same stuff, but how big is it? How close together is it? And do you have a network of streets as opposed to very few streets, what's called a branching or dendritic system? And these are the 2 models. Now I'm going to talk entirely about what I spend most of my time on now, which is the improvement of existing city centers like yours. And if you're looking at a downtown or the potentially walkable area surrounding a downtown, and you want to make it, right, we're in the useful category, you want to make it as useful as possible, you ask this question: what is underrepresented among all these different uses? Usually it's housing. In most historic downtowns, housing is not well represented. When housing comes back, everything gets firing, every cylinder gets firing, and the things that aren't as good as they could be immediately get better. What you're looking for in cities like yours is a jobs-housing balance. I believe we just guessed your downtown jobs-housing balance is about 10-to-1. And the closer you get it to 1-to-1, the more of a successful downtown you'll have. But of course, a huge part of that conversation is transit. Because you can have a walkable neighborhood without transit, but walkable cities rely on transit utterly, because you have to connect the walkable parts of the cities to each other, and you have to connect the jobs that aren't yet, you have to connect the houses that aren't yet downtown conveniently to the jobs that are downtown. And then finally, there's another question: what is underpriced and overrepresented? And the answer there is almost always parking. And Ray and I talked, and Ray, we decided I had an hour and a half to speak, so I put all this stuff in here. But parking, one of the things we said that we had to talk about was how you need to price your parking more intelligently here. And this fellow, Don Shoup, he's the master of American parking. He's figured it all out. Instead of asking the question, how can we have enough, he asked the question, how can we arrange parking so that our cities will thrive? Simple question. And the answer is basically to price it according to demand, as San Francisco is doing in a large part of the city, where you price it the right way so that there's always a limited vacancy so people who want to shop can shop. And cities that are doing that are raising the price of parking where there's a great demand, are succeeding above those who aren't. Finally, what's valuable in being wasted? And often that is also parking in the form of these parking decks that you find in downtown. This is Lowell, Massachusetts, where they had all these empty loft buildings to fill with residents, and they couldn't afford to do so because of the cost of providing parking for the potential new residents. And what they did was identify 5 city parking structures downtown that were empty all night. And they were assigned to the buildings, and they were able then to affordably fill the buildings with units. You have a lot of parking lots downtown. A lot of them are probably empty overnight. That can be used to float new development by lowering the cost, by making the parking effectively free. Second category is the safe walk. It's the biggest category. It's 100 different moving parts that I'm going to show you about 5 of them because we don't have much time. The first, of course, is the number of lanes, whether it be a highway or a city street. The more lanes, the less crossable the street is. And we've widened our streets to absorb new traffic, right? There's congestion because there's more cars than there is capacity. So we widen the street to absorb that. But what we learn is that there were all these latent trips that weren't happening because in congested systems, the principal constraint to driving is congestion. So it happens over and over again as you widen your streets. Newsweek magazine says today's engineers acknowledge that building new roads usually makes traffic worse. I wish most engineers knew that. Newsweek knows it. Most engineers don't. And they make you widen the road because they tell you the traffic's coming. Then the traffic comes and they say, see, we needed that extra lane. So the message here is, isn't that you might not need new roads or wider roads, but never do it in the name of congestion. This is the study that was presented at the Paris School of Economics. I have no idea what this means. But this means that every road fills up within 4 years. Every new road, every new lane fills up within 4 years. Metro areas that invested more in roads to ease congestion basically ended up lengthening everyone's commute and spending more money. So you've got some highways. You are much less attacked by highways in your downtown than many American cities. But certainly don't build any more and start thinking about how you can selectively reduce your highway lanes. Here's an easy win. The 4-laner that you have in your downtown, the classic American road diet. When you turn a 4-laner into a 3-laner, like this, you gain an extra lane for bikes or for parking. Injuries drop precipitously, but surprisingly, the number of trips that the road handles doesn't change at all. So you can do that immediately on certain roads in your downtown. Additionally, the width of the lanes, the typical road to the typical subdivision in America, now allows us to witness the curvature of the earth, right? Because the standards have changed. 1960s subdivision, 1980s subdivision. Look what happened to the streets. My old neighborhood in Miami, they took away half our sidewalks and half our trees because the street wasn't draining properly, so the new standard kicked in. So wider streets or faster streets? Look at your lane widths here. Where can they be narrower? Right? Lane widths equal fatalities. So how long do we have to keep building wide streets? Many cities still have a 12-foot standard. I believe you now have the 10-foot standard, which this is stolen from a conference, bootlegged, but the next IT manual will say a 10-foot standard for all city streets. So make sure you don't get wider than that. One-way streets. One-way streets are not good for safety. They're not good for businesses. You have some one-way streets in your downtown. Vancouver, Washington famously converted this street back to two-way. Business doubled immediately. I'm working in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where we're taking a half one-way, all 4-lane system, and we're making it an all, I say restripe, don't rebuild, restripe. It's much cheaper. We're making it an all, we're turning this into this, which allows you to turn this much parking into a lot more parking and allows you to turn this much biking into a lot more biking. Reallocating street space, as an earlier speaker mentioned. Bikes, the greatest revolution currently underway in only some American cities. It's underway here. I was glad, this is Portland, Oregon, of course. My main message here is that bike activity follows investment. It's that simple. Climate, not so important. Topography, not so important. These kind of bike lanes that Gabe Klein showed you from Chicago, they mint cyclists, the protected, buffered bike lane. And I'm going to run ahead because there's a couple more things I want to say and I'm running out of time. But when this was put in in New York City, of course there were more cyclists and fewer accidents and less speeding, but the road handled just as many cars as before. And that's a super important message. So biking is not a cult, okay? It is something that cities want. These are the maids who travel from house to house in Washington, D.C. on bicycles because we have the buffered bike lanes. And this is what tech companies are saying they want. So I congratulate you on your effort here. I'm going to stop there because I am out of time. But I've found that in work, and I haven't told you yet about the comfortable walk and about the interesting walk, so you'll just have to read the book or find me outside. However, what I've found, someone asked me earlier, what's the low-hanging fruit when you go to cities and they're looking to improve their walkability quickly, cheaply, effectively? And almost always it's looking at your streets, what's happening between your curbs, and reallocating street space, particularly where you have a disconnect between demand for lanes and supply of lanes. And we find it almost everywhere we go. So reallocating that space, I think, will be essential to you. Congratulations on the work you're doing already, and thank you for your attention.
We don't even need a question. You answered all questions. Are you good? Okay. Thanks. But Jeff, one thing, just the interesting walk. Do you have like the 50-word version of the interesting walk?
Well, the interesting walk basically, the interesting walk is not surprising. Basically, we want to see signs of other humans. We want to see not blank walls, and we don't want to look at parking decks. What's counterintuitive is the comfortable walk. And what the comfortable walk is, in 30 seconds or less, all animals simultaneously seek prospect and refuge. We can't help it. It's in our bones. And so we need to feel that our flanks are covered from attack. That means that when you're in a street space that has a surface parking lot or some other missing tooth, or it's not well shaped by buildings on either side, you actually flee that. You flee that street space. It becomes sociofugal. So lining the streets with great buildings is almost as important as making them safe on the surface.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Appreciate that.